singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Okay? That tells us what we're to use as we make this melody in our heart. We're using psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So psalms is a part of it. And we know that in the Old Testament era, when David and other writers wrote these psalms, mainly they were set to some kind of music. The word psalm actually means a song. And that's why we titled our lesson, Songs for the Soul. That's what the psalms are. Other passages I'm sure you're familiar with, such as, there's the word psalm for us, such as Colossians 3 and verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. So when Paul wrote this, he was enforcing again that idea that the tools that you use when you're singing and making grace in your hearts to the Lord, the psalms are a part of that. You've probably noticed too that many of the psalms in our book that we sing are psalms set to music. I like them. You find many of them toward the end of the song book in that the hardback version. It seems that Brother Stevens, when they edited this book of songs, they found a lot of them that were songs set to a particular tune. And they're very good ways to sing and teach each other. Another passage, 7 minutes to hit the wrong thing there. Just give me a second. This is going to be my downfall, I guess. Just a second. Here we go. Now, the writer James tells us about many things. One thing he says, though, in the 5th chapter is what to do when we have different emotions, like when we're sick or when we're happy or whatever. And one of the things he brings up here, he says, is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Okay, James is a strong advocate of prayer. He's the one who said the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. But then right on the heels of that he says, is anyone cheerful? Let him sing psalms. So singing is a way to express joy, cheerfulness. Many of us have known maybe older Christians who just seemed like they were singing all the time, singing around whatever they were doing, working in the kitchen, working in the yard, at their job, whatever. There was a lot of just singing, and many of those songs that they sang were based on the Psalms. So as we continue, Psalms are indeed songs for the soul, and they're useful for especially, you might be surprised at this, many people think the Psalms are just flowery speech about general principles, but no, they are useful for teaching and confirming that Jesus is the Christ. Many of the Psalms have very detailed prophecies that relate to Jesus and his relationship as God's Son. Jesus himself made use of the Psalms in this. If you take your Bible, let's turn to Luke chapter 24. The Gospel of Luke, right at the end of it, chapter 24, when Jesus has appeared to his apostles before he ascends back to heaven. And starting in verse 44, Jesus tells them this information. These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which are written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. And he opened their understanding that they might comprehend the Scriptures. Then he said to them, thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And you're witnesses of these things. When Jesus explained to his apostles that everything that they had read was being fulfilled in him, including what was read in Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. Many times we don't study the Psalms as much as we really probably should. because they are a wealth of insight about what Christ was to be. When Jesus brings this up, you can be sure that the apostles recalled from their studies, and they were studious people. They knew the law, and they studied it, and they studied the Psalms and the prophets too. But they would have begun to make connections with all those prophecies that were found concerning Jesus. Another place we find them is in Peter's sermon, and don't desert me here just yet. Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts. If you'll turn just a few pages over to Acts chapter 2, we see here Peter using the Psalms to a great deal of effect in his sermon which he preached there to the first people to become Christians. Let's just take a look at a few places where he did this. In the second chapter at verse 25. Now, Peter has just begun his sermon here. He has started off by saying, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man tested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs," and so on. He talks about that they had taken him with lawless hands and crucified and put him to death. He also reminds them whom God raised up, having loosed the pains of death. It was not possible that he should be held by it. And then he goes right into a quotation from Psalm 16, starting in verse 25. For David says concerning him. Now David is the author of this psalm, and he says, "I foresaw the Lord always before my face, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart rejoiced, and my tongue was glad. Moreover, my flesh also will rest in hope. For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of joy in your presence." Now, Peter takes that excerpt from Psalm 16, and he properly applies it to Jesus. Jesus is the one who was not left in Hades, or the place of the dead. Jesus went there, but he returned. He came back from that place, and he did not see corruption. He did not decay and follow that pathway that normal humans do. So Peter makes use of that. Also in that same chapter, verses 34 and 35, after Peter has related this to Jesus, and also to how Jesus was to sit at the right hand of God in the throne of David, he points this out to him in verse 34 and 35. For David did not ascend into the heavens, but he says himself, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, till I make your enemies your footstool." All right, well, that's from Psalm 110. And Peter is like any good preacher. He's bringing in those references to nail down his points. And the point he nails down here is that Jesus was not like David. David didn't ascend into the heavens, but Jesus did. He is at the right hand of God, he says. So those are some pretty strong points there. And there are many others that you could look at where the relationship with Jesus as the Messiah is mentioned here. Now we get back down to this one. We're also wise if we think about the way the Psalms are organized, the way they're put together. Now, I'm no poet. I don't know much about it. I can tell when something rhymes, sort of. Roses are red, violets are blue. There's something that comes next that rhymes with all that. Sugar is sweet and so are you, and all that. But, the Hebrews had different systems. I don't know Hebrew, do you? I wouldn't know if the Hebrew statement rhymed with another one or not, because I don't know what they sound like. But I do know this, that in the writing of the Psalms, there's a thing called a thought rhyme. It's a rhyme that doesn't depend on the sound necessarily. What it depends on is the content. What's in the thoughts of the writer. And there are some here. It's also called, I found this in the encyclopedia, it's called parallelism, where you have two statements that are parallel to each other. They are not the same, but they complement each other. It involves arranging thoughts in relation to each other. It's done without any concern as to whether words rhyme with each other, But in the Hebrew, when the Psalms were being written, they were written kind of like this. In Psalm 24 and verse 2, for example, David wrote this one, "For he," that is God, "he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters." Okay? I don't know if that rhymes with words or not, but there are two statements there that say the same idea, they're just worded differently. See how that works? He founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. It's the same concept, but it's one of those parallel thoughts. All right, and another one might be Psalm 1, which we're going to look at more in just a few moments. Psalm number 1, "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish." Note the contrast there. You have a statement and then another one that's similar but contrasting. What's different about the way of the righteous and the way of the ungodly? This double statement here tells us. Anyway, that might be helpful as we study the Psalms to know how they're put together. Who wrote the Psalms anyway? Most of us think automatically, well, David. Okay, and you're probably right. King David, the second king over the United Kingdom, did write about 73 of the Psalms. There's a lot more Psalms than that. A certain individual named Asaph wrote 12 of them, and the sons of Korah wrote another 12. Solomon, David's son, is credited with writing 2 of the Psalms, and even Moses wrote Psalm 90. How do we know this? Well, many of the Psalms, in the heading of the Psalm, before you get to the actual words of it, there will be a statement there that the writer left that tells who wrote it and sometimes what the situation was. Many times they'll say, this was written by King David after he escaped King Saul's attempts to kill him. Well, that puts it in pretty good context. You can tell what the writer was trying to get across then. All right, so Moses wrote Psalm 90, which is a psalm of praise to God. A gentleman named Ethan wrote one psalm that we give him credit for. And then there are about 48 of them that we don't know. They're anonymous. They're not labeled as far as who the writer was. Sometimes they sound a lot like the ones David wrote. Maybe he wrote it and didn't sign the authority for it. But what does this tell us? It tells us that the Psalms, although the Psalms are inspired, they come from different points of view. Sometimes one psalm will express an idea differently than another psalm. Same idea, but a little bit different based on who it was that actually wrote it. And that's important too to keep in mind as we study further. So let's take a look at Psalm number 1, just for the few minutes we have left. The first of the Psalms is a favorite of mine. I know many of you enjoy it as well, because it tells us some good information. It tells us about how we can be blessed. The first line in the first verse says, "Blessed is the man." You want to be blessed? Here's something about it. And so we find that the word blessed means truly happy. Another way to translate that, blessed means happy. The truly happy man is one who does these things. One thing it says is that in the first 3 verses there are some character traits that the truly blessed man has. Let's examine the first 2 verses. "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night." Okay? You get some sort of character references here about this person who is the righteous man. He's described a couple of ways. Did you notice there? The first part of this is sort of negative. We're told what the godly or righteous man does not do. It's with those things that you're not supposed to do. Let's look at that. He walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. That's an important idea. Not walking with the counsel or guidance of the ungodly. He doesn't stand in the path of sinners. Standing in the path of sinners means occupying the same pathway they're traveling. It doesn't mean blocking their path. That's not what it means here. Standing in the path of the sinners is occupying their space, going along with them. Nor sits in the seat of the scornful. To sit in the seat of something is to acquiesce to it, to put your okie dokie on it somehow, to sit in that seat and vote for it. Okay? But you see, we're not to do that, not to sit in the seat of the scornful, those who have a bad attitude about something or some idea that's being professed. Well, don't we gain from this? There are certain places where we shouldn't be if we want to be a truly happy person. All right? Now let's take a look at that. Proverbs, the 4th chapter. I marked that one for us to take a look at. Just turn over a few pages to Proverbs chapter 4 and verses 14 and 15 give us a little more detail here. This is from Proverbs. Now Solomon is the writer here. Solomon's pretty well given authority for writing all these Proverbs here. Verse 14 and 15 he writes this: Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it. Do not travel on it. Turn away from it and pass on. That's pretty good, isn't it? That tells you no doubt about it what you're supposed to do. Yes. Don't enter it. Don't walk on it. Avoid it. Don't travel on it. Turn away from it. Several admonitions there. Just like Mom used to say, right? If I told you once, I've told you 500 times. Well, there's not 500 times here, but it's plenty of extra ammunition to not do these things, not to make alliances or walk in the way of the wicked. Psalm 26. Turn back to the Psalms again, and just a few pages over there. Psalm 26, verses 4 and 5. This again is a psalm of David, but he gives us a little deeper insight. He says, I have not sat with idolatrous mortals, nor will I go in with hypocrites. I have hated the assembly of evildoers, and will not sit with the wicked. Okay? Well, that pretty well lines up with what the first psalm says. Don't sit in the seat of the scornful. David says here, I have not done this. And his example is given to us here. I will not sit with the wicked, he says. All right? Now, down at the bottom, we can also see in that first psalm some descriptions of a positive nature. If you're not supposed to do these things, then what are you supposed to be doing? And this is where we find the positive side of instruction. His delight, we're told, is in the law of the Lord. That's in verse 2. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. If something delights a person, then that person's likely to be pursuing it. He's going after it. If something is delightful to us, we want to attain it. We want to accomplish it, take part in it. Psalm chapter 40 and at verse 8. We've got several different ones marked here. We'll just take a brief look at them. Psalm 40 and verse 8. This is David writing again. I delight to do your will, O my God, and your law is written within my heart. If we delight to do something, then it's probably internalized. It's within us. It's written in our heart. David says that. He also says in Psalm 119, verses 47 and 48. If you can flip over there to Psalm 119. Verse 47. Psalm 119 is pretty big, so look around for it. Verses 47 and 48. And I will delight myself in your commandments, which I love. My hands also I will lift up to your commandments, which I love. I will meditate on your statutes. All right. So all this delightedness that the blessed man feels is toward God's commandments, which he says, I love. Isn't that strange? Many people today would say, oh, God's commandments. Yeah, he's just trying to keep us from having fun. He's just trying to hold us down, trying to keep us from being our own boss. Well, we must not love those commandments then. Because David says here, I love those commandments. They're what I delight in. Even the prophet Jeremiah, over in Jeremiah chapter 15, puts it this way. Jeremiah kind of uses a picturesque description of it here. Your words were found, and I ate them. And your word was to me the joy and rejoicing of my heart. For I am called by your name, O Lord God of hosts. Yeah, Jeremiah says, I found your word so delightful, I ate them up. And what happened? Your word was joy to me and rejoicing. So, important idea there for us. What about that second part, though? The scriptures say here that the truly happy man meditates day and night in the law of God, in God's word. So you look at Psalm 119 again, and this time, let's look at verses 97, 98, 99. You even notice, if you read this carefully, you'll find this sounds like a song that we sing. Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day. You, through your commandments, make me wiser than my enemies, for they are ever with me. I have more understanding than all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. Oh, how I love your law, says David. And how come? Well, he says, because I meditate on it and I benefit from it. Yeah, I have understanding from that meditation, more so than all my teachers, he says. So, again, some pretty good admonitions for you and me today. But when we apply these practical things to ourselves, there's a question we probably ought to ask, and that is at the bottom there. Am I looking out for the negative and the positive factors for my soul? There are negative and positive factors here about being blessed, but, for example, the Apostle Paul, when he wrote to the Galatian Christians, what did he say? Let's take a little look over there to Galatians chapter 5, and starting in verse 19. Now, the works of the flesh are evident, and I'm not going to go through everything there, but you start there and it begins with adultery and goes all the way down to envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like. A long list of sinful activities, which he says here are the works of the flesh. And he says they're evident. You can tell what they are. Just as I told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. There's the negative. Verse 22 starts in on the positive. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. So, we get some more instruction here about positive and negative. Let's talk more about the blessedness of that righteous man. He is prosperous, Psalm number 1 says. He shall be, verse 3, like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth its fruit in due season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. Well, that's what you'd expect. A river gives nourishment to the trees that are planted nearby, and a tree planted by the rivers of water is going to flourish. It won't die out. It won't shrivel up and die. It'll produce fruit and even more trees besides. Psalm 92, we get a little bit of this input from King David. Psalm 92, and I think it's verses 12 through 15. The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those who are planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bear fruit in old age. They shall be fresh and flourishing, to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. When you read those words, it tells us that these words here in the Psalms are reaching deep inside us. They're reaching to the things that make us flourish. And he says, if you're righteous, then you will flourish and grow that way, like a tree planted by the rivers of water. Also, the prophet Jeremiah. We don't often think of Jeremiah as very poetic, but here in Jeremiah chapter 17. Go over to that. Chapter 17, verse 7 and 8. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, and whose hope is the Lord. For he shall be like a tree planted by the waters, which spreads out its roots by the river, and will not fear when heat comes. But its leaf will be green, and will not be anxious in the year of drought, nor will cease from yielding fruit. I mean, Jeremiah even likens the tree planted by the waters to something that will weather the storm. It'll be there when the drought comes. No water, no problem. This tree has roots that stretch out to the river below, and it's sustained. And it will continue to grow. Not only that, it'll bear fruit, even in the times of drought. Well, we're not trees, but we do have a need for sustenance. We reach out, we pick up those things which God tells us are good, and we make use of them. We can be fruit producers even when times are hard. When you read about people back in the days of the Great Depression, think about that. Though times were extremely hard, it's amazing how many stories there are of individuals who went above and beyond to help somebody else, who just went out on a limb to make it happen for some of their friends in need. There's even a story I read about a farmer back in those days who was absolutely flat broke. He was a member of the church, and he went to the bank and he said, I want to mortgage every last piece of property I've got for X amount of money. And the banker asked him, why? He says, you're going broke. There's nobody to buy anything if you grow it anyhow. And the man said, it ain't for that. He says, I need to keep my church contribution going. And I'm going to borrow whatever I can to keep it up. He was that concerned about the Lord's work. So that's an interesting concept when you think about it. Like a tree planted by the rivers of water. Brings forth fruit. The leaves don't wither. Whatever he does will prosper. Back in the days of Joshua, when the people of Israel were about to take possession of the promised land, the first chapter of the book of Joshua, God appears to Joshua as he's about to lead the people in and conquer this new land of theirs. And here's what he says to him, verses 7 and 8. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Just imagine God telling you that. You're about to embark on the biggest battle of the whole known history just about. And God says, you stay with me and you'll be prosperous, you'll be successful. Joshua did that. And of course he was. Now, what do we think about? Are we preparing for spiritual prosperity? How do you prepare for prosperity? Do you guard against downturns? Well, if you were depending on the stock market lately, you blew it on that one, didn't you? But what can we do? Spiritually speaking, 1 Corinthians 15:58, Paul tells those Corinthian brethren to be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Why? Because you know your labor in the Lord is not in vain. That's what he says. Prepare for prosperity because you know your labor in the Lord will be good, then therefore be steadfast. Be abounding. Always be above and beyond what you can do. Then as we wrap up our thoughts, if I can get this thing good, what happens to the wicked? Well, go back to Psalms 1 for just a minute. And this psalm is interesting because it not only describes the blessed one, but it describes people that aren't as well. The desperation of the wicked. Wicked are nothing like the righteous. Look at verse 4. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind drives away. The ungodly, some translations say, not so are the ungodly. They're like the chaff which the wind drives away. In Job chapter 21, there's an image that Job comes up with there about the chaff the leftovers from the grain threshing process. You got the grain here on the floor, it's good, we're going to keep that, but the wind blows the chaff away, and you don't even see it anymore. It's of no use to anybody. The chaff, he says, is like those who are ungodly. Well, that's a downside, isn't it? We also find, and here we go, that they have a dismal end. The righteous, written about earlier, are going to prosper. Their leaves won't wilt. Their fruit will continue. They'll be on the banks of the good old river. The dismal end of the ungodly is in verse 5. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. They won't be there, he says. The sinners shall not stand in that number of the righteous. And the righteous are the ones who will stand and be successful before God. Their end is indeed dismal. Am I prepared to stand in judgment? We might ask. What does Paul say in 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter? We know what instructions Paul gives the Corinthian Christians. He says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. Yes. Are we prepared for that? Have we done things to be like the righteous, or are we going to end up like those who are unrighteous and face a dismal and very dreary failure at the end? And we just try to get one more page to turn here out of this thing. There's a final contrast. Look at verse 6 there of Psalm 1, and it sort of sums up everything. He says, the Lord knows the way of the righteous. What a thrilling thing, to be known by the Lord, to have God himself acknowledge us. That's the way of the righteous. But the way of the ungodly shall perish. That's the ones to whom the Lord will say, depart from me, I never knew you. Depart into everlasting darkness, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Depart into destruction for eternity. Yeah, that's the sad part. There's a final contrast there. The righteous will be known by the Lord, and that'll be their way for eternity, but the ungodly will not be like that. We're going to sing the song in just a moment now to encourage anyone to think about your spiritual condition. What are we like? Are we like the righteous, blessed, happy, truly happy man? Or will our situation end up like the ungodly? And knowing each of us best as we know ourselves, we know where we are. We know what the situation is. And if there's a way that needs to be gone to correct things, we know that, don't we? We're not in the dark here about these spiritual matters. And so the song actually asks a very good question: why do you wait? It's addressed to dear brother, dear sister, why do you wait? If there's something that needs to be corrected, then now's the time